two-punch knockout, it would take out everyone, so to speak. So if I had to plan a reset where I want a completely new economy or whatever they are touting at the World Economic Forum, if I would want to do that, I would generate a short-term deflation first. So also the people who have assets and debt lose everything.
Maneco 64, home of alternative economics and contrarian views. Today, I have the pleasure of speaking with Arpad from Starpath Academy. It's the second time we do an interview for my channel. I've spoken with him for his channel as well, but it's been since July, so just over 4 months that we spoke. And back then, we were looking how to get through economic collapse and hyperinflation. And I highly recommend the viewers watch that video. I'm going to put it up in the cards so you can have a feeling get a feeling for Arpad's background. Some of you, of course, might know his background. So Arpad, thank you for sharing your time with us. And maybe quickly tell the viewers again a brief summary of your background.
Hi, Mario. Very nice to be talking to you again. I've been looking forward to this again. Sure. So I was born in Romania while it was still under communism. After communism ended in '89, Romania went through a very high inflationary period. Sort of a hyperinflationary period, and I was a young person back then, but that has left its imprint on me, and I didn't even quite understand what was happening to us back then. But after that, I started studying economics and monetary policy and even politics a little bit to figure out what is causing hyperinflation all across these countries, what sparked the issues in Romania, and I try to merge the experiences that I have from my youth together with the lessons learned from my grandparents and parents who also went through different hyperinflations in Eastern Europe, but also with what I learned since then, and just by looking at the news and trying to make sense of what's happening in the markets, what's happening with monetary policies, and hopefully synthesize some knowledge and some wisdom out of that.
That's great. And just before we move further, just wanted to let the viewers know that I highly recommend Arpad's YouTube channel. It's Starpath Academy. And yes, so in July, we spoke about, of course, your experiences in Romania and what could happen in the Western world. And since then, of course, we've seen CPI, for example, in the US rise quite at a quite elevated pace. We're over 5%. The last reading was 6.2. In Europe, it's the same thing. Even in Germany, which used to be a bastion of sound money, I would say, up until the euro came about in the late 90s. You had the Deutschmark. Even in Germany, we were running almost at 5-6% CPI. Their PPI is the highest it's been in over 50 years. I saw in Spain as well, the PPI was over 30%. PPI, of course, being the producer price index. So my question is, yes, we might not get the numbers that we saw in Weimar Germany, the 1,000% or 1,000,000% inflation, but could you tell the viewers how even high inflation, maybe 25 or 30%, really dilutes the purchasing power of one's savings?
For sure. So definitely the mask is slipping more and more. I mean, it was pretty obvious for anyone who was looking with historical perspective how things play out. And but we had the transitory mantra first, and it's just periodic, and everything will normalize. Well, turned out to be normalized means everything will just continue at the same rate and hopefully not worsens. But right, so just before these inflations, usually there's a spike in some commodities. That is sort of a tell sign that things are breaking down. We had a spike in lumber early on, then copper and other materials. And that is sending signals to producers later on that this will be affecting them. And eventually this inflation starts to work itself into the production lines and into the really the whole chain of the economy. And we're actually now just starting to experience that the first wave of inflation, which is not as bad, right? But it could get worse from here. So people misunderstand inflation and high inflation because, frankly, most of the Western countries are fairly rich, and we have, or a lot of people have extra wealth that they can support themselves on. So a increase of 20%, 50% in gas prices, that only shows up at the gas pump for you. But later on, it starts working itself into consumer prices, production prices, and so on. So a 20% increase in inflation means that you're buying less stuff from the necessary stuff, but you still have something to cut back on. Maybe you're purchasing less stuff on Amazon that you didn't need anyway. Maybe it's cutting into your savings a little bit, but as soon as that starts compounding year over year, 20% inflation eats up a lot. And as soon as there's the price in your energy, your food, and housing starts to go up to where somewhere about 50%, then we get to a situation what we saw in Northern Africa right before the Arab Spring, because that was one of the major issues that, or the causes of the Arab Spring, that compared to their salaries and compared to their income, that inflation was eating up more and more and more out of their minimum pay, I should say. And as soon as, so 20% is not that much, but year over year, there's a breaking point after which there's nothing left. And unfortunately, a lot of people, it's only then when they realize that that 20% increase of inflation pretty much ate up all the possibilities away from them, and there's nothing left. And at that point, it's just people are scrambling for food and energy. Case in Romania as well, because a lot of people in our family didn't pay attention to inflation. It was just a number. We just went into the store every day, but it really only hit us when food prices and energy price was pretty much at least half of my parents' salary.
Yes, and since we spoke last in July, we've seen a huge move up, especially here in Europe with energy prices, natural gas. We use a lot of natural gas for our gas and electricity here in the UK. And we're learning as well a lot about the intricacies of the economy, how natural gas and other sources of energy are so important for manufacturers, even for food and packaging. And I've seen recently that fertilizer prices in the US are going up a lot, and for all over the world. So do you think that pretty soon, with higher energy prices, higher food prices, that this could trigger or change the consumer's psychology as it pertains to higher prices or inflation?
Well, it takes a while to normalize, in people's mind that this is your new future now, that this is the percentages that you will be paying for food and energy. And it takes some time. Just, if gas prices increase, fertilizer prices, that will take time to kind of work into itself to the food price increase. But by that time, you're already pretty much late. There's not much you can do. There's not much you can prepare for. So, unfortunately, eventually it will get to a point, or it could get to a point where people lose faith in currency, in the sense that this year we have experienced it at the gas pump with some food items and so on. But eventually, when it seeps into the minds of the people that, hey, if I want a new refrigerator or a new car or even a new house, I might as well get it this year and not, take my time until next year or something like that, because most likely it will happen the same thing what I experienced at the gas pump a couple of months ago. I will experience it in each and every product that I'm purchasing. At that point, it's really a loss of faith in currency. That's what's happening. You're losing the faith in the currency that it will keep its purchasing power. And that is really the first turn of the hyperinflationary spiral, because from that point, it's really a panic game, and he who panics first panics best, so to speak. And that point, it's just downwards from there, unfortunately. There's you could lose the faith in currency without losing the faith in government. You could lose the faith in government without losing faith in currency. Both can have a hyperinflationary spark. And of course, the worst is when people lose faith both in government and both in currency. In our case in Romania, it was the loss of faith in government happened during communism or the end of communism, then a transitory government until the democratic government was implemented. But during that time, faith in currency was lost. But actually, through those 7 years, the faith in government was seeping back in, because we were getting handouts, checks, stimmy checks now they call them, but back in Romania we used to get these checkbooks and that sort of stuff. So actually the faith in government was still somewhat intact. That is why, but the faith in currency was no longer intact. That is why we were able to eventually, after 7 years, come back with a new currency, a new Romanian lei, and kind of continue the economy. However, if faith in government is both lost and faith in currency is lost, it's much harder for government to deal with social uprisings and civil disputes and everything that could happen. So yeah, it could happen at any moment.
I think, I guess, because in Romania you had high inflation, it wasn't like a Weimar, and I think it might have been because of you didn't lose faith in the government either. But right now, it feels like a lot of people, maybe not a lot, but a pretty big minority is starting to lose not just faith in the monetary authorities, but also in the governmental authorities, with all the things that they've thrown at us in the last, I don't know, 18 months. And we don't have to go into detail about that. I think most people know what's going on, especially in the last few days. There's a new variant. But moving on, I've listened to some of your videos. I follow your YouTube channel and some of your interviews, and maybe you can help the viewers, because I always get a lot of questions about this, and you having experienced this in Romania, or your parents and grandparents might be able to give them a better idea of how dangerous it is to keep one's fiat currency savings in the bank, not just on an inflation aspect where the purchasing power gets devalued or debased, but also the safety of keeping those funds in the bank. Maybe you could give the example of the Romanian bank, and maybe your uncle and aunt who had quite a lot, enough to buy 3 houses, I think.
Sure. So, almost every case that I studied and the people I interviewed, it was pretty much the same tune all around, that as soon as this faith in currency and just the mentality of people shifting, where I might as well spend it now instead of wait for a year or next year, because who knows what it will be worth. When this knowledge has been seeped into the minds of the average people, at that point governments and monetary institutions will try to hold on to cash or hold on to your assets, so you don't spend it and you're not actually making the problems worse. And traditionally, while the economy is still working, usually just raising interest rates is enough, but that implies that you still have some faith that this will work. If that doesn't work, what they almost in every case what they do is they just have a 2-day holiday for the bank, or a 1-week holiday. In Lebanon, it was the case for a 2-week holiday. The same thing in Romania. We only had one bank under communism. It was the CEC, which was acting like a bank. It was more government controlled, the safest thing that you could have, government backed and all the rest. And of course, as soon as we were even getting to high inflation status, before hyperinflation or even higher inflation, the very first thing that they did was close the CEC, close the bank. And that means also security deposits and every account being frozen. And it was always played off as something temporary because there's a shock, there's a crisis that we need to do. And, your money is safe. Usually they lock it into a savings account or something like that, so you cannot spend it into the economy, worsening the problem. However, of course, in Lebanon now, that's like 1.5 years that they got stuck. In our case, it was sort of like 2 years. I think the first 2 years of the hyperinflation that your money got stuck. And of course, by that time, depending on the rate of inflation, you could lose pretty much everything in the purchasing power. And I tell the story of my aunt who did inherit a large sum of money, and it was more of they would have needed to divide that money, but practically back then the amount of money would have bought them 3 different houses. So, and they even kind of looked at houses, what to buy, how to spend that money, but they couldn't agree on it. And this was right before that bank closing. And after the bank closed and the money was stuck in there, the same exact nominally the same amount of money that would have purchased 3 houses eventually bought them 1 television set, the black and white television set. So, and they still don't call this hyperinflation. So hyperinflation is just the speed of inflation per month. If it reaches a certain speed, then it's called now hyperinflation. But you don't actually have to be in hyperinflation. If they lock your money away for 2 years, by the time it month by month that reaches, the 14 or 24 months, it pretty much counts as hyperinflation if you didn't have, or you were not allowed to move that money or purchase with that money. So that's almost the case in every situation that I studied. Yes, and there's really not much you can do about it. There were some protests and everything, but once the doors are closed and or I guess in the apps are shut down, it's whatever was in the system is stuck in the system and it becomes worthless.
And yeah, because for example, here in the UK, we've got like a FSCS. It's a guarantee. It guarantees the first £85,000 in your account. In the US, you have the FDIC. I think it's $250,000. So all those guarantees from the government, when this happens, they mean nothing, right?
Pretty much nothing. So you have to read the fine print, but I think, well, I can't remember the year. You probably have a better memory when it happened, but eventually every asset or every dollar amount in the United States that is in the bank got reclassified as, the bank's property. It's their liability to pay it back to you. So as soon as you put your money into the bank, it's the bank's property, and you have a promise on you getting that back. Now, they could pay that £80,000 back, but by that time, after 2 years, because technically they're not taking your money. The money is in the account. Maybe it get under, a crisis or some new rule, they can just lock it into a savings account. They're not taking it. They're just not allowing it for you to spend it. And then after a while, that $80,000 or 80,000 Romanian lei eventually bought you, 80 loaves of bread, while it could have been a really good nest egg, when everything started. So they're not taking your money away. I'm pretty sure every clause in that, in that document will be kept, but with some new clauses added onto it where your money is kept until it becomes worthless. And at that point, you'll buy a television set.
So you were talking about that your money is still there, it's still on the screen, but you can't touch it. So maybe with that, we could move on to prices and value, because you've spoken recently with Lynette Zhang, and you're talking about the gold price could be at 200,000, but it doesn't matter if you can only buy a loaf of bread. That was a really interesting concept. Could you go into that a little bit?
Right. So in high inflation, your prices inflate at different rates. That it's not everything in lockstep. Usually it starts with raw materials, then tools and stuff that you actually consume the raw materials for, eventually end products, services. Eventually it goes into food, and after that it goes into salary, because they will have to raise your salary somewhat in order for you to afford the prices. However, there's a time difference between when it starts the very first the link of the chain, and usually the last link of the chain is salary. So depending on how fast the inflation is and how well or unwell it is managed by government based on their abilities, usually not that well. The time difference between prices rising and your salary rising is that what makes you poor. Like just because something doubles in price, your salary doubles, or maybe not quite doubles, but is raised again 6 months later. By that time, the whole loop started over. Like you will be able to afford the bread that you bought that you cannot afford at that nominal price in 6 months. By that time, everything has kind of is running forward, running ahead of you. But within those cycles, each and every consumer good or different food items or different energy has their own rate of inflating, and it usually fluctuates. So it's very so when people say about, gold or silver could come and multiply its value, or get to maybe like a couple of extra $1,000, extra $100,000 in our case, in 100,000 Romanian lei in our case, that doesn't tell you much. And when you're looking at historical charts, you're looking at maybe the price of housing going up significantly in Romania or in Weimar Republic. But what does that actual amount buy in food or in energy. So it's really, you have to compare one thing against another thing. And that way you can make your evaluations during hyperinflation or during high inflationary times, if it's a good trade or not a good trade. Because just because gold goes up, you know, a couple of $1,000, that might look good to our eyes now, but in hyperinflation, maybe it's still lagging. Now, usually that's not the case. Gold does go up quite significantly at the very early stage of hyperinflation, but so does real estate. And usually real estate kind of tops off somewhere, while gold and some of these other assets don't. So you have to measure one thing against another thing, because a loaf of bread was 1 Romanian lei at the early state, and eventually it became 10,000 Romanian lei, right? So during that time, it was fluctuating between very large different numbers, but that doesn't mean that you know, something else could have bought a lot of bread or less bread. So it's one thing against another thing that you have to measure, and you have to make historical charts measuring, let's say, stock price against gold price, or stock price against energy price, or energy price against gold price. And then you will see these large cycles, maybe cycles of 60 years, cycles of 40 years, 20 years, and so on. And then you will be able to sort of, well, not predict, but kind of look where things are heading. And during hyperinflation, what's usually happening, those lines cross. And suddenly, there, with a couple of ounces of gold, you get to buy houses or multiple houses. While even if you look at the house chart during hyperinflation, it went up tremendously, but actually it was falling compared to gold, and maybe even gold was falling compared to food price.
Yeah, that's a really good point, because we get asked a lot of questions, you know, where do you think gold's going to go? What's the target? But what you said there is really interesting, because you could also see the stock market go up, let's say 100 times. But if gold goes up 1,000 times, the stock prices are actually falling in real terms. So now I wanted to move on to more practical things, what people can do to survive, not hyperinflation necessarily, but high inflation. And what do you think are the most important qualities or skills that people need, and also the social side of things, the community side of things. Of course, having gold and silver and other assets is important, but it's not the whole game. And we won't go into it, but I know that during the high inflation in Romania, there wasn't much, not many people had gold and silver because of the communist background. So maybe you could tell our viewers a little bit about what you think are the most important skills to have, the most important attitude, and also like social interaction and community, community activity.
Sure. So actually, one thing we did have back in Romania during those times was a community. You know, people used to have larger families. They families, or you know, they used to live in the same town. And that would have meant that, you know, your next door neighbor could be your grandma's cousin or something like that. So the community aspect was there. And I think that actually helped Romanians a lot, especially in small towns. It was there. It's probably still there somewhat now. And that is why we were able to sort of barter ourselves out of the crisis, or survive the crisis through barter, and sometimes you know, just working for free to each other, you know, not even counting actual time or value, just, hey, we needed to get this done, so everybody joins this family this weekend and we raise the barn, or something like that, where everybody goes to the field, to the potato fields that we had, and we took care of business. So that aspect was there, and I think it's one of the most important aspects, even before making sure that you have precious metals, or even probably food, because if it's a long-lasting hyperinflation, you will have to work out some way of growing food or barter for food, and actually having that network or that very basic layer of trust within your community is much more important than any financial thing that we talk about on YouTube. Because when that is there, we can trade skills directly, and we can survive that way. So regarding skills, so the skills, usually the hands-on skills that are like, fixing cars was a really good skill. Plumbing was a really good skill. Being able to take care of the roof was a really good skill. Gardening was a very necessary skill, but also being able to make gardening tools out of just metals and that sort of stuff was very important. Also, bartering is a skill, being able to kind of feel out what the community needs, being able to make markets, so to speak, because everything became very localized in these little markets that were on smaller towns, where everybody just brought what they would sell on every Sunday or so, and then people would trade sometimes items against items directly. But for that, you had to have a layer of trust, and that usually was not there during that was not there in major cities. So everybody actually moved out of cities into these smaller communities. So that was very important. However, now with a lot of people actually buying homes and owning new homes, they tend to spend a lot in these stores like Home Depot or Lowe's, making their house more beautiful, and quote unquote adding value to it. That was not that important, because really survival was at stake, and growing food. So when I'm talking about skills and hands-on skills, it was fixing only the essential stuff. After hyperinflation, Romania, especially the cities, looked horrible. Like there was, just small gardens or small green parks, or that you normally people take care of during good times, or the government has a budget to take care of those. I mean, it will look horrible. Even the outside or the inside of the houses looked horrible, because the walls were coming down. We didn't always have money or the tools or the time to fix up everything. So that became unimportant, but more of the essentials, like actually the plumbing working, the car starting, that was a good thing, but not caring about whether it's a new car, whether the paint looked good, whether it was dented or not. So and that of course does have a psychology like a way on people, that everything becomes more and more depressing as things are breaking down around you, and you can only care to make sure that your family is fed. So regarding that, you have to have a positive eye even during these times, and try to look at the good things and be happy for the very small things you have in life. And that was definitely there in my grandparents' generation, but my parents' generation had a very hard time, because they were the bread providers, so to speak, and they kind of felt the fall completely, whereas my grandparents' generation kind of went through these cycles, or more of these cycles, and they had a more holistic view of history and what happens during these times. But when it hits, making sure that your faith, you have your faith in life, or just in your family, and being able to survive, or the will to survive, needs to be there, because the alcoholism was a big problem, drug use somewhat, but also suicide became a huge problem. So making sure that you're taking care of physically, spiritually, mentally, is much more important, because you could have a lot of gold or silver or even money or whatever you have. If you can't survive this situation because of mental issues, what does it matter, right? Now, so making sure that you have community, making sure that you can mentally go forward, another important thing, but also having food, and also the ability to grow food or barter for food was very important. After that, I would say probably precious metals, or something that you can, a vehicle that you can save your pre-hyperinflation wealth into the post-hyperinflation world, basically. And physical items was mainly the thing, however, not a lot of things have still value in 7 years. Technology changes a lot. Even housing is changing, because a good neighborhood could become a very bad neighborhood, or vice versa. So you have to make sure that you know what you're doing.
I wanted to ask you, what do you think are the reasons for inflation, and why do governments and the powers that be inflate and then maybe deflate? And what do you think the end game is, and why do they do that?
Sure. I mean, it could be many things, but usually it's always one of the following. It could be they want to push a restructuring, a political restructuring, an economic restructuring in a grander scheme, or changing one type of economy into another type of economy, usually trying to take control or taking control over these, sometimes in Eastern European countries, Western European countries, were moving in their values, their value systems, but also being able to purchase up these underappreciated assets during hyperinflation. So it's usually a power grab, economic restructuring, political restructuring, because hyperinflation or inflation is really just a tool of achieving something more grand, right? And that was the case in Romania. We went from a socialist or a communist economy into a more capitalist economy, and that restructuring was done in a very fast way. And well, in Russia, they used the term, I think, shock therapy or something like that. So it's usually a restructuring of power, I should say, of power, and also a transfer of wealth. And usually a transfer of wealth means that in these cases, the people who suffer the most is the middle class and the upper middle class, in the sense that they lose more, right? Because they have something to lose. Now, suffering was there definitely for, the poverty layer of society. However, their fall was not that big, but as soon as they fell, it was already survival mode for them. However, let's say a family, a well-established family who has multi-generational wealth stored in stocks, bonds, even possibly property, maybe even gold and silver. They have, multi-generational wealth stored, and everything is doing well. When a hyperinflation happens and now everybody starts to scramble for food, during these times, they might have to sell everything, even the house, whatever gold they have. Stocks and bonds usually go to near zero, or everything stays at the same level, but hyperinflation takes the cost of everything else so high that the stock values basically becomes nothing. And that was the case actually with my mom. My mom actually owns some stocks, but I can tell you that story sometime later. So it's a power grab, a political restructuring, an economical restructuring, and a transfer of wealth, basically.
Yes, I was looking at some numbers today of wealth in the US, and from the Federal Reserve. And it's gone from 20 trillion, all the wealth, household wealth in the US in 1989, and it's now at like 134 trillion. But the debt as well has gone from 13 trillion to 85 trillion. So the debt is grown a lot quicker, especially for the middle and lower classes. But I agree with you. When this reset, if you want to call it, happens, I think the people in the middle to upper class, and maybe even the top 1%, could be hurt very, very badly. Do you have any idea what's going to happen? Have you got like an opinion of what could happen, let's say in the next 12 months? Could we see like a deflation? Could they use what's happening now in the world in terms of health? Another reason to deflate things like they did in March last year, and then after that, and that would, of course, like bankrupt a lot of people, and they'd be able to buy a lot of assets, and then they would hyperinflate. Is that something that you are looking at?
Right. So very good question. Thank you. So when I was talking, what is the reason for hyperinflation? I think those are the reasons. However, hyperinflation does have side effects, and one of the side effects is, and sometimes the reason for government for inflation is to get rid of debt, actually. But it's usually sometimes it's just really a side effect, because at some point, if the debt of the country is internal, it doesn't really matter much. So who you own that money matters more than how much you own for a country. So the side effect of that is inflating the debt away, but that also somewhat trickled down to the average people who were in debt. It was actually wealth transfer from people who had wealth to people who had debt, because the debt got inflated away. And if the people who had quote unquote wealth, if it was paper wealth, it got inflated away, no problem, they lost everything. However, if they even had physical wealth, they might have been forced to sell that to survive. So it's sort of an equalizing, it has an equalizing effect, but everybody gets reset to the lowest level, so to poverty, basically. Now, I wanted to say that because in Romania, during communism, we had very severe austerity measures to pay off the national debt. So actually, Ceausescu, the dictator Ceausescu, was able to pay off Romania's debt. And we as a country didn't have that much debt. And the actual people had somewhat assets, somewhat stored up Romanian lei. Now, how much value that had in the Western Europe, that's debatable. But technically, it was that very few people had consumer debt or anything like that. It was probably even illegal, and everyone had some sort of wealth or paper wealth stored up. So the worst possible situation for us was hyperinflation, and it happened because that way we lost the wealth that we had. Now, especially after coming off the gold standard after 71, and money becoming actually debt all around the world, it's a bit of a different situation, because now a lot of people have debt to their eyeballs in the United States. So actually, if you're very poor and you have a lot of debt, then hyperinflation might help you. So I'm not sure if just immediately starting to hyperinflate would be that bad for so many people. It would be definitely bad for the wealthy. However, a two-punch knockout would take out everyone, so to speak. So if I had to plan a reset where I want a completely new economy, or whatever they are touting at the World Economic Forum, I would want to do that, I would generate a short-term deflation first. So also the people who have assets and debt lose everything, because if you have physical assets like apartment buildings, but you're totally in debt, if we just have hyperinflation, the debt is hyperinflated away and you remain with a lot of assets. Now, that was a good strategy in Romania. but might not be that good of a strategy if we have a short deflation first, where your debt becomes more and more harder and harder to pay off. You might actually have to liquidate assets to pay off the debt, right? Banks taking property, and such. So if we have a deflation first, that takes care of these people, right? And then if we hyperinflate, that sets the field level again, and then you get to have your new economy or political structure, so on. So of course, I can't tell what will happen, but to me, if I would be planning a reset, I would do a short deflationary spiral first, where everybody is losing their assets that could make them rich during the hyperinflation.
Maybe Klaus Schwab will hire you, or BlackRock. Any final words to the viewers before we conclude?
Sure. So, I mean, these are interesting times. These are transitory times. Playing on the word of transitory, but transitory could mean 20 years, could mean 7 years, and it might be half of your life or the rest of your life for some people. So you really have to start enjoying these times, in the sense that you got the opportunity to live in interesting times. And there are sayings in Hungarian, is really life starts when things are no longer stagnant, so to speak. When everything is can be accounted for, it is somewhat boring. Now, of course, I know if we could skip the suffering part, that would be great, but be intrigued by what's happening and not too afraid, because whatever happens monetarily, if you have good connections, if you have family, loved ones, and people to care for, and people that can care for you, you will survive. And if you're smart enough and listening to Maneko 64 and hopefully my channel as well, you might as well, you might even get better off on the other end as hyperinflation or whatever calamities happening. So not being afraid is very important. Being lighthearted, even the worst of times, is very important, because if not, you will have to worry about health issues first before the financial Armageddon comes. And so I think not being afraid, making plans, preparing, but also looking for hope and looking for other people who you can help, because honestly, that gives the most hope and most power for you to survive if you're helping other people. So not being afraid is very important. And after a while, and even my family, after hyperinflation, we were better off, actually. But you have to know what you're doing. You have to seep in all the knowledge from the people you can, prepare, and be lighthearted.
Great. Thank you very much, Arpad. Yes, I hope to talk to you again in a few months' time. And I'm also free to come on your channel again if you want. I wish you a great rest of the weekend, and take care.
Thank you very much.